Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Today, I have Christian Klepp on the show. Something you'll see is that I asked Christian a lot of the same questions that I asked Meredith Metzger on an episode recently. The reason I did this is because it's a great contrast episode, but they both stem from the same place. Marketers out there running shows internally with no real outside help at their B2B companies. The difference here is Christian's built a 3-person team at his organization, while Meredith is a one-woman show putting together the podcast. It's no easy task what these folks are doing. They've really defied the odds to make great shows through successes and failures by putting together content in audio, video, written, and image-based formats. Christian is originally from Austria and a current Toronto resident, and he's the founder of EINBLICK, which is the German word for insight. EINBLICK is a consulting firm that provides marketing solutions for B2B tech and SaaS, and he's also the host of B2B Marketers on a Mission, a weekly podcast started in mid-2020. I talked to Christian and break down his process and how he executes his podcast with his 3-person podcast team. Enjoy the show. So, you run a weekly podcast and have been doing it since, I think, June 2020, but you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, that's correct.
So what have the last 1.5 years of being a B2B podcaster been like?
Well, it's been thank you for having me on. And to answer your question, it's been an incredible journey, full of learning, to say the least. I mean, talk about just hitting the ground running, right? Because when I started out with the podcast, it was, we came up with a strategy. So it wasn't an approach, right? We were very clear about who we were targeting. So it's not, let's go and get my friends on to talk about random things, right? We had an approach. And I think this was one of the questions that was posted on LinkedIn, but the purpose for the podcast, for me, is personal and it's also professional at the same time. And what do I mean by that? It's things that came out of my personal experience that I've seen working in this space over the years and also with clients that I work with. And what is that? I'll get to the point. The mission, and that's why I called it that, the mission is to get B2B organizations to stop treating marketing as an afterthought, right? And to start giving marketing, to use the podcast term, the airtime that it deserves, right? That voice at the table. But in order to get to that point and to achieve that milestone, marketers need to change. I mean, there's no other way to say it, really, right? Marketers have to change. So much has changed, not just in the past year, but there are so many things that have shifted in the B2B marketing world over the past couple of years, and marketers need to adjust accordingly. And how do they do that? To quote Apple, we need to think differently, right? We've got to continuously learn. We've got to look at what we're doing right now and see what it is that we can improve. And also, to quote Seth Godin, it's like, what might not work, but is worth trying, right? So that's been that pretty much also sums up what my journey's been like these past 1.5 years of running the podcast. It's been a great learning curve, but I've made a lot of great friendships and clients along the way and partners, and I've had the pleasure of meeting a lot of incredible individuals, and that's also how I met you, right? So a shout out to Mark Hogan for making the introduction.
Yeah, awesome. And so what I want to do today is I want to go through your process, and feel free at any point when I'm asking you these questions about your process to also talk about how that process may have evolved. I recently did an episode very similar to this one where I broke down the process of Meredith Metzger's show, Beyond the Queue, and they haven't been doing it as long as you have. I think you have about a year on Meredith, and so it'll be interesting to hear from you a little bit of an expansion on some of these questions as to maybe how it started and how it is now, and what led you to that. So the first place that I want to start, and just to give the audience a glimpse into your process, is to get an understanding of what your podcast team looks like. So internally at EINBLICK, what does your podcast team look like?
Sure. So the team consists of 3 people, myself included. So, I mean, at least in terms of like my role, besides being the podcast host, I'm the guy that came up with the podcast strategy, if you will. And that basically, in so many words, that means, why are we doing this? Who are our ideal listeners and why? And what are they going to get out of listening to a podcast episode that we push out, right? And after that, I did the content strategy. So basically, we're not just like randomly pulling people that we have identified from LinkedIn and let's interview them. What I did was I spent quite a bit of time researching, platforms like LinkedIn and, other websites online to see what B2B marketers were talking about. Not just talking about, but what are these questions that they're posting on forums and, posting on LinkedIn about? What are these challenges that they're facing, these issues, these trends that they're, that are being discussed, and how is that affecting them and influencing the way they work? And based on those, I try to sift out some questions and insights, and I put that into a content calendar. And after I do that, I try to identify, okay, link this issue or question with a specific B2B discipline. I'll give you an example: SEO, CX, so customer experience, branding, market research, the list goes on. And then I go to LinkedIn and I try to identify people who have that specific area of expertise. And it's a bit of a long-term approach, because I connect with them, I engage with their content, and we have conversations, and then I slowly slip it in there and say, by the way, I run a podcast and this is what it's about. Would you be interested? Right? Then they come on, right? So I'm doing the strategy, doing the content, finding the guests, building relationships with them, conducting the interviews, and I'm also reviewing the recording afterwards, right? Mm-hmm. Once I review the recording, which is exported from where we're doing all this fun stuff, so it's on Zoom, so we download the audio and video files. I review all of that, check if there's anything that needs to be edited. I put that into a Google Doc and pass that on to my other 2 colleagues. So one colleague is doing all the sound and video editing. Once that gets done, gets passed back to us, myself and the other colleague, and we review the audio and video. If everything's fine, my other colleague then takes it and drops it into Otter, which will help us with the transcription. But as you know, it's AI, right? So it's not going to be perfect. It still requires an actual person to do all the editing. Then the transcription is done. Then it gets passed back to me, and then I do the episode summaries. So short format and long format. And the long format's the one that you see on LinkedIn that I post every Wednesday. Once I'm done with that, it then gets passed back to my colleague that does the transcription, and she then does the video snippets, which are done in Headliner, and the subtitles, which are then used for the video format of the interview, which are then going onto YouTube. And she uploads the audio file onto a platform that we use for podcast hosting called Blueberry, right? That all then gets pushed out through a platform that we use for posting called later.com. Everything is then live on Wednesday morning at around 7 a.m. Eastern, right? But the fun doesn't stop there, because now the episode's live, and then we continue producing all those other pieces of content. So the video snippet, the LinkedIn image carousel, the quote cards, and all of that, right? And then there's different summary or copy that then gets that complements the LinkedIn the image carousel and the video snippet, right? So that's basically like what our team does, and those are all the roles if you want to break it down.
Perfect. And what I'm going to do is I want to break down each of those tasks and responsibilities. So the first one that I want to go through is finding guests. So how do you go about finding your guests? So you mentioned some of identifying, specific marketers with specific disciplines, but how do you go about finding your guests?
So it goes back to the content calendar. And don't get me wrong, the content calendar is not written in stone, right? I have iterated it a couple of times, right? And the reason why I do that is because I try to keep you can say my ears to the ground to see what's trending. Not necessarily just what's trending, but what's relevant. What are people talking about that's interesting? Because there are topics out there that people don't engage with at all because either it's overrated or there's just too many people talking about it, right? Then I look at the content calendar and I specifically put a topic there based on questions that people ask or pain points. And then I again go back to, okay, so what area of expertise can I link that specific topic with, right? Then I go, and LinkedIn is really my go-to platform, right? Where I go and find people who may have this area of expertise. And again, it's a bit of a lengthy process because you have to go and connect with these people. I do a profile scrape. So I actually do my homework before I reach out to them, right? I try to find, okay, so what are they an expert on? And then some of them are generalists, so it might be one of their areas of expertise. And then I reach out to them and say, hey, listen, would you like to come on? Then we schedule a call. I send them my Calendly, and we have about 30 minutes is about the time that I need to have that discussion pre-recording with them, right? And then we discuss it, right? Like, hey, listen, so this is your area of expertise. Like, for example, customer success, right? Customer success is a discipline that for the moment only exists in B2B SaaS, right? So, and I've had two gentlemen on talk about this topic. So the next question is why are you bringing on two people talking about the same topic? And I say, you got to look at it from a journalist angle, man. There's different ways to approach the story, different angles, right?
Yeah, and one thing that you mentioned is, and I guess I'll tackle both of these. So you use Calendly as your calendar booking tool, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how you leverage that. It's crazy. I bring this up, and I brought it up on my previous podcast episode as well. Is
Sure.
that some things that people take for granted that they just know about, like using a calendar booking tool, seems like second nature, but some people, are still out there saying, hey, what's your availability for next week? So use calendar booking tools. And then you mentioned prep calls. So talk to me a little bit about your process for booking using Calendly, and then why you do prep calls.
Great questions. Calendly really is, I've also learned to use it. In the beginning, I was doing exactly what you just mentioned. Hey, would these dates work for you?
We've all done it. And then when we started to realize that there's this tool that mitigated 5 steps of negotiating times back and forth, man, this is way easier.
It's way easier, and I'll tell you the other hurdle we encountered, and that's the reason why I switched to Calendly, because a lot of my guests, many of them are not based in North America, so you're talking about people that are based in different time zones. Sometimes, depending on their organization and their level of seniority, I sometimes have to go through their assistant, right? So if I use the old approach where I have 3 options with 3 dates and 3 times, it's going to take forever to book that person's time, right? So why don't we just cut through all of that? Just give them a link, and the guest themselves doesn't have, they don't have to do it. I mean, they can get their assistant to book a time, and so that just saves everybody time and effort and heartache and pain at the end of the day, right? So that was the first question. Sorry, what was the second question?
Yeah, my bad. There you go. There's a tip for the audience. So that was a double-barreled question, which you should not do, which is asking 2 different questions in one. So I need to go back to Podcast 101 school. The second was prep. You mentioned doing prep calls. So yes. Do you do prep calls? And if you do, it sounds like you do. Why do you do prep calls?
Yeah, I do them, and I really do them to genuinely get to know the guest, right? I'll be perfectly honest with you. I think when I first started podcasting, I would say the first 10 episodes were people I knew either personally or in my professional network. Everybody beyond episode 10 was a cold outreach on platforms like LinkedIn, right? So beyond what I see on their profile, I don't know that much about them. And I think it's always important to get that feel, like a little bit of chemistry. I'd almost compare it to, like, if you're going for an audition, right? Because then you can see what they're like on camera, what their voice sounds like. Not just their voice, but like, okay, talking specifically about their area of expertise and getting a feel for how they talk about that specific expertise, and sharing your thoughts with them about, like, okay, these are the things that I'd like to discuss, and why you agree or disagree with them, or is there anything else that you would like to bring up? And more often than not, a lot of these guests are very generous in sharing not just their expertise, but also stories from their personal experience, which I think brings a different level to the show, right? Because you're not just talking, or I'm not just getting somebody on that's an expert in data analytics. You're also getting the background of, like, how this person got to where they are today. And I think that's extremely important. And it, to varying degrees, also very inspirational.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best part for me about prep calls, well, I think it's twofold. One,
yeah,
I think it's good to get to know people and build some of that rapport. And then two is the opportunity to really tee up what the episode is going to be about. And then if I say that my biggest negative about prep calls, and I think if you remember this from when I went on your show, Christian, and we did the prep call, I remember you had, like, I was getting passionate about the topic, and I know what it's like on the other side as the one running the prep call, and I'm like, save it, save it for the episode. So what I actually do a lot of times is I really try to focus on the framework of the episode.
Yes.
Like, what are the specific topics that we're gonna hit on? What are a couple of talking points that person wants? And I usually don't have them go longer than about 10 minutes. Okay. I have my guest kind of tee up, hey, here's like 3 or 4 things that I think I want to talk about. And I've mentioned this before on this show. The way that I like to phrase that question is, here's what my show is about. Here's the audience that we help. Here's why I thought you would be a fit for the show. But what do you think you would bring to my audience? And I just listen to some of the ideas that they have. I write them down. And what I typically don't do is go like that next layer deeper of, like, asking too many follow-up questions on what they think that they would bring to the audience. Because I already had my idea. And that's why I brought them onto the prep call. And now they're giving me their idea. And my approach is, okay, now I have these 2 ideas. I need to go to the lab and bake these and figure out how they work together. And what I don't want to do is over-orchestrate it on a half-hour call that I get off the call and go like, well, shoot, I should have been hitting record on that call. So usually I have them go for like no more than 15 minutes.
Yeah. No, totally understandable. The other thing that I would say, which I didn't bring up earlier, is the other reason why I have these pre-interview calls is to help manage expectations. And I'm not just saying I'm not just saying that from the guest side. I'm saying for both sides.
Yeah.
Right. So that both of us get a feeling for what the conversation is going to look like the next time we congregate, and then I hit the record button, right? And it's also, like I said, to have these discussions about the topic, but it's also for me to go back and then draft some interview questions. I do have a set of standard questions. I do tend to throw in 2 or 3, which are customized specifically for that guest based on their area of expertise. So that helps to keep it a little bit different, adds a bit of a flavor to each episode.
Awesome. And so on that note, let's pivot this conversation a little bit. I want to move past the guest booking and guest prep portion of it, and let's go into script writing. So how are you developing your scripts or questions?
Yeah, exactly. I call them, I'd like to call them questions. I don't really want to say that it's scripted. But you know from doing this yourself, Justin, it's a bit of a fine line between sounding too scripted and just winging it, right? So it's kind of somewhere in between there is like where I hope I'd like to get with the show. I do have a standard set of questions which I tend to ask, and how I change. I like to change it up a little bit just to add a little bit of variety, like I said before. So based on the topic, so I try to customize the questions based on that, and then usually I'll throw in 2 or 3 questions that are specific to that individual, right? And what do I mean by that? And I think you are one of the good examples of that. I will usually do some research, so whether it's on LinkedIn or I'll Google that person and see if they've been featured somewhere, or if it's on LinkedIn, did they post something that got a crazy amount of engagement? And usually when I say crazy amount of engagement, I'm trying to imply that it was positive, right? And then I'll bring that into the conversation and say, can you talk about that a little bit? And or if you were featured in you were featured in Forbes and you talked about these 5 strategies, can you expand on that a little bit? So that also helps to demonstrate that yes, I do want to get to know my guest better on the one level or on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also I feel that they have been featured somewhere or their post got a lot of engagement on social media, and and through that they can then add value to the listeners through that insight that they communicated, right, or through those opinions that they wrote about.
And when it comes to how you actually record, so you've got your guest booked,
Yeah.
You've got your interview scheduled, you have your questions written.
Yes.
What's your approach to actually recording?
The approach is relatively straightforward, and I already give them a heads up in the pre-interview call, and because I do it on Zoom, and that's a platform that many people are quite familiar with. I know a lot of other podcasters are using, other platforms, like you're, for example, using Squadcast, and there was another one the other day I jumped on, and they're using Riverside. But generally, everybody's familiar with Zoom. The only thing I tell them is, for example, like if they can have headphones, try not to just use your, the speakers that are built into usually they're using a laptop. That more often than not doesn't suffice. And also more often than not, the guests tend to be in a room. This gets a little bit technical, but if it has a very high ceiling, then the acoustics, then it bounces all over the place, and it sounds like they're in a dark enclosure, right? If they have a microphone, fantastic. Many of the guests I bring on tend to be a bit more experienced with podcasts these days, so they already have that. Then I just walk them through, okay, so this is what's going to happen. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. And usually when we start the conversation and I ask the questions and they answer, when they're answering, I mute the mic, right? And I mute the mic because I don't want to be one of these hosts that's doing yes, making all those comments while the person's talking. And what I usually do then is I take notes. And while I'm taking notes, that helps me to capture that information that they're sharing with the audience, but it also helps me to come up with questions that are not on script, right? And that again keeps everybody on their toes, right? And that's the general recording process, I would say. And I usually just ask them to stick around as we're wrapping up.
And you mentioned the acoustics, and I'm curious about audio for sure. So what equipment do you have versus what your guests have?
I mean, I'm using these noise canceling headphones, which tend to help, and because especially if you're using a Blue Yeti mic like the one that I'm using, it captures a lot of noise from outside, right? And what I'm trying to do, for example, in the recording room, I've just got this structure set up in front of me, which is just really built there to capture some of that noise, or to trap the noise inside the room rather. So that's really what I have, and I've got one ring light on the side just to help with the lighting a little bit, and that's pretty much what in terms of what I have set up.
And on the guest side, something that I've heard on occasion is that people are nervous about doing video. Now, we'll talk about video in a second, because I think there's
Sure.
a whole nother beast to having nervousness about video. But when people come to me, usually they're like, well, you're just going to do the video for me. But my concern is that, because I'm sure you can attest to the difficult, just how difficult doing video is. But if we start on just the guest side, I have heard people are, nervous about doing a video podcast as well, because maybe people will be unwilling to go on video, or there will be less ease of use or something along those lines. So what have you experienced running your show as both a video and audio podcast?
Okay. I'll have to say that the doing it when we started out, I was just doing audio, and that tended to be easier because, you don't actually see the guest. And many of the people that I interviewed in the very beginning of the show, I didn't really have issues with them. What I tended to notice, as we switched over to video interviews as well, you had issues. Like, for example, they were either in a room. It usually had something to do with the background or the lighting, background lighting and sound, rather, right? So sound, just as I said, right. There's some guests that weren't they were not wearing headphones, and you could hear the echo in the background, right? Or they had noise from the street, which they can't really control. Background, I mean, yeah, I've heard two different schools of thought here. Some say that my background, for example, is boring because it's just white and plain. I think it's the safest option, because sometimes I've interviewed people that have an extremely cluttered and noisy background, right? And that's very distracting if you're watching a video interview, right? The other one is it's in terms of the lighting. Like, sometimes they're sitting with their back towards the window and the sun's coming in, and you get that issue as well, right? So they'll have to close it with a curtain and whatnot, right? Or they're just in a room that just has very bad lighting, like it's just too dark, for example. So I try to. It doesn't happen too often. I mean, again, many of the people I interview have experience with podcasts, but there are some, on occasion, some people that I still have to coach through the process, and it's usually a 5 or 10 minute quick fix, or they solve it by simply going to another part of the house if they're working from home.
Perfect. And where I want to go now with the conversation is, all right, so we got this captured, recorded, using your questions. We've got our video and audio. So what are, I want to move into post-production. What are all of the assets that come out of B2B marketers on a mission?
You're talking about in terms of the content, right?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about post-production now. So what are all of the content pieces that come out of the show?
Okay. Right. So, first you've got the interview in audio file, which is hosted on Blueberry. Then you've got the interview in video format, which is hosted on YouTube. Then you've got the short interview summary, which goes on the company page on LinkedIn. You've got the long, I call it the long tail episode summary, which goes on my personal feed on LinkedIn, together with the podcast artwork. So it's basically the person's photo, the name of the episode, and the person's name and title, right? Video and audio snippet, which we create in Headliner, and that's also got subtitles underneath. You've got the LinkedIn image carousel, which is, I try to keep it under 11 slides, right? So that's those are generally your key takeaways that usually comes in a list format. Then you've got the quote cards. So somebody's quote. Oh, sorry. Let me go back to the image carousel for a second. The image carousel with the 10 to 11 slides, that gets posted on LinkedIn. They also get chopped up into different formats, and they are then posted also on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest, right? We use those platforms to a lesser degree. And then you have the quote cards. So you're looking at 7 to 8 pieces of content.
Yeah, because it sounds like we've got a few short promo videos. We've got the quote cards. We've got the slider. We'll get into whether or not there's a written component. We've got the full-length audio piece and the full-length video piece. So I'm going to break each one of those down, and I want to get into your process. So let's start off with the audio component. What is your process for developing the audio piece?
So when we're doing the recording, once the recording's wrapped up, we export those files. As you know, there's a video part which is in MP4, and then we export the audio, which is an MP3. I review the files to see if there's anything that needs to be edited, and then that gets passed to the video and sound editor. He then edits the sound in Audacity, I believe it is. And the finished product there then gets reviewed again by myself. And if that's fine, then the audio part gets uploaded on Blueberry.
Okay. And then for video, talk to me a little bit about that. So you've got your your long form video that's going on YouTube, and then short snippet pieces for LinkedIn. So talk to me about your process for video.
Yeah. So the video, as you know, is a little bit trickier than the audio, right? Because there's a lot of parts like, okay, so again, if I'm reviewing the recording and I'm trying to like take out the parts, as you know, there's either awkward silences or there's too many ahs and ums, or somebody made a mistake, and carefully documenting all those things. It's extremely time consuming, right? But it needs to be done, right? So we take I document all of those things that need to be edited and removed. I then insert that into a Google Doc, which is shared in Google, which the editor can then see. He then goes and edits the video and throws in, besides the editing, he throws in a branded intro and a branded outro, right? So there's a little bit of an introduction to the podcast, and then, okay, now here's your host, Christian Klepp, and then it transitions directly to the start of the interview. And then towards the end, as we're wrapping up, there's a little like outro that comes up with the show's logo, and then the video ends, right? And so that's the video aspect of the interview, right? What we then do after reviewing that is identifying, and this usually happens after we do the transcript. We review a couple of portions of the interview where we feel those are great insights, or that's a great nugget, right, that people can take away. And we extract that and throw that into to create the headliner video snippet. And I'll have to say, Justin, it was after I had that conversation with you that we kind of like shifted our approach a little bit. So thank you for that tip. Because prior to that, what we did was we just had a still we just had a still image of that guest, right, with the what do you call it, like a sound wave, right? So when somebody's talking,
like an audiogram,
right? An audiogram, right? There you go. So we stopped doing that, and we just switched to like, okay, we'll throw in some footage from the actual interview itself, and then include the subtitles down there. And lo and behold, we've gotten better engagement now. After every time we put it out on LinkedIn.
Well, you're welcome. I gave you more work, but it sounds like at least the work is paying off. So that's great.
It is.
Okay. So we've got the shorter video snippets, which you're doing in Headliner. Then you've got the longer form video. And then I'm just curious if you're doing anything on the written side. For us, we have our show notes, which are like 500 to 1,000 words. And then we do featured articles based on episodes, which are up to 2,000 words, more of like a longer form blog post. Are you doing anything on the written side?
Great question. I'll come clean and say that we haven't done any blog posts yet, and that's definitely something that we need to work on. And again, I think it's back to your point at the beginning of this conversation. It's just, okay, bandwidth, right? Who's gonna write all that stuff if we're doing all that work internally, right? But what we are doing right now, in terms of like written form, is yes, we are doing show notes. We are certainly doing transcripts, and we do get a lot of comments, and this is more from a qualitative perspective, but we have gotten comments on LinkedIn from people that have listened to some interviews on our show that did appreciate that we put show notes out there and transcripts. And I would say the people that appreciate the transcripts are people who are professional copywriters, because that's how they learn, right? They look at the written word. And then these long form, these long tail posts, right, of the episode summary. And there's a specific format that I use for those. So it's not just like, okay, I interviewed Justin for my podcast and go and check it out. I really try to set it up in terms of like, I usually start it with using a quote either from the guest or a famous quote. And then I use the PASS approach. So problem, agitate, solution, right? And link that back to the interview, because that's, the guest spoke about a specific challenge. This is why it's something that B2B marketers care about. And this is the solution that the guest offered. And this is what I discussed with the guest. And it's on our podcast. And then click on the link in the comments below.
Yeah, and we do something very similar. We use the ABT method, which is by Park Howell, which is and but therefore, same idea.
Yeah, right.
Which is setting up with someone did something and this happened, but then this other thing happened. Therefore, this was the solution. Same idea of trying to use basic storytelling approaches for written content out of a podcast. And another thing I'll say is I try to do that also with the actual podcast itself, trying to set it up as more of a story
Correct.
than just a conversation. I think you talked about that a little bit as well, which is, treading that fine line of being overly scripted, but then also not winging it. And something I'm very not passionate about, but maybe just that I take a strong stance on is not winging it. I don't think that I think the odds of you being able to help your audience, like truly help your audience by winging it, you're probably not setting yourself up for success. So let's pivot now. So our episode is completed. We've gone through the post-production process of audio, video, the image-based content. What happens next?
So after all those, I call them all those assets or all those deliverables are completed, and they're not all done, in that order, like before the episode gets pushed out, right? So what I mean by that is like we push out an episode every Wednesday. So let me just talk to you about what goes out on the Wednesday morning, right? And this is usually when I say Wednesday morning, I'm talking like 7 a.m. Eastern, right? So the audio on Blueberry, the video on YouTube, all of that, plus the show notes and the transcript and the short and long episode summary, all of that is embedded on our website under this section Insights and then Podcasts. Then it also gets pushed out on LinkedIn. So again, short format, long format. Short format on the company feed. It doesn't get a ton of engagement, but that's just LinkedIn for you. And then the long format on my personal feed, right? So that gets pushed out on a Wednesday. The video snippet gets pushed out on a Friday, right? Along with the quote cards that then go on Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest. The following Monday, so Monday a week after, that's when the image carousel goes out, right? So so all of these assets go out at different times, but it's in that specific order.
And what are some of the KPIs that you track with your show?
Only downloads. No, I'm kidding. We've had this discussion before.
I was about to hit stop. Say we're done here. Thank you.
See ya. I'm gonna say, and this might make me a little bit unpopular with some people, but I tend to also look at the KPIs that are not quantitative, right? But let me start with what we can measure, right? So, or we do have like numbers to to account for. So one thing that we do look at, I mean, we do look at downloads. We just don't like take them too seriously. Like, why do I say that? I'll give you an example. And it's we saw this in the past year. We had one particular episode, right, that had a really high number of downloads. It also had the highest number of people dropping off. And what that means in layman's terms is people dropped off like 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes into the recording, which told us, okay, so that was early on in the piece, and that was a great. That was a great lesson for us, right? That meant that there was something that definitely was wrong there, right? So what are we looking at now? And I hinted at it like a couple of minutes ago. We look at completion rate. And completion rate meaning how many people that listen to the episodes listen to it from start to finish, right? In an ideal world, 100%, but in reality, we know that usually doesn't happen. But what we have observed in the past, I'm going to say, the past 4 to 6 months, right? At least with the last 20 episodes, I can tell you right now, the completion rates have all been above 50%, right? In fact, about 46% were about between 75 to 100% in terms of completion rate. That's one thing that we look at in terms of how we measure our success. The other thing that we look at is not just the completion rate, but in terms of engagement, downloads, and completion rate for specific topics, right? And that's how I also do some of my planning moving forward. So for example, and only people internally are going to know this, but I've had 4 people come on to talk about B2B content marketing, right? And some members of the team are like, well, why are you bringing on somebody for B2B content again, right? And I say, because, again, back to my journalist analogy, there are many ways to tell this story, or there are many angles to approach this. So every time I bring somebody on for B2B content marketing, it's for a different angle, right? So I brought one guy on that talked about strategy. I brought one guy on that talked about AI and content marketing, right? I brought on one guy that talked about how you can use content marketing for organic growth. So he wasn't dismissive of paid. He just his business is on helping B2B organizations and marketers to build their brand using organic growth, right? So that's those are some of the things that we do. Those are some of the things that we look for. The other one I would say is social sharing and social engagement. So if you really want to break that down, it's we have a look at the level of engagement on the posts that talk about these specific podcast episodes, right? Mm-hmm. So you're gonna get a different answer depending on which source you look at. But LinkedIn basically says if your engagement rate is about 2%, that's good engagement, and anything above that is great, right? So we've seen from the long tail episode summaries, those usually get an engagement rate above 2%, right? Sometimes it goes as high as 6%, right? The one that's next in line are the image carousels. I was actually surprised how well those did, right? But then again, it's about observations and social listening. So we did research that a little bit afterwards. It's not just that there are a lot of people that are visual learners out there, but people like to look at lists. Mm-hmm. Not just lists, but actionable lists. Yeah. Lists that you can go and take away, and you can actually use them, right? So it's not just the theory; it's the actual application, right? So those are some of the things that we look at.
And something that you mentioned was that on the KPI side, it doesn't always come down to KPIs as to why you run the podcast. So maybe just talk a little bit about why your podcast is important to you from just the qualitative standpoint.
Yeah, great question. It goes back again to something I said earlier, right? It's because I truly believe that marketing needs to have a stronger, and if I dare say, a louder voice at the table in B2B organizations, right? Mm. We have seen that change. It's just not happening fast enough in my personal opinion, right? And I have seen it time and time again, especially in B2B tech and in SaaS, that marketing, I'm not going to say that marketing gets sidelined, but they just don't get the budget that they actually need, right? Mm-hmm. It kind of goes back to some of the people that you work with, Justin, because these are people that are they're a department of one, right? They are mandated to deliver on these specific objectives, and they just don't have enough bandwidth and resources internally to be able to pull all of that off, right? So how does all that link back to my podcast? It's to help people to start thinking differently about marketing. So not just the marketers themselves, but the people who sit higher up in the C-suite as well, right? And also another thing which I've also been doing with the podcast is I really believe in building this online community, and I'm really grateful to some of the contacts I've made on LinkedIn these past 2 years. And I'd like to give marketers, B2B marketers that I know are talented, that I know have the experience and expertise, I'd like to give them a voice or a platform, right? Because some of them have just not spent enough time online because previously they probably didn't find it necessary. Well, guess what? I'm not going to say it, but you know what happened last year, right? And that's why we're all here, right? Give them a platform that helps them to become more visible in an online landscape and helps them to build their personal brand further. And that's really what this platform or this podcast is about. It's not about me. I mean, if it were about me, I'd call it the Christian Klepp Show, but then nobody would listen to it, right?
Awesome. And to finish up here today, I have the questions. And I asked these same questions to Meredith. I tagged you both in a post saying, hey, I have these B2B marketers coming on the show. I know you're a business owner, Christian, but you live and breathe the B2B marketing world. So I put it out there on LinkedIn. I said, hey, I've got these two B2B podcasters in marketing that I'm interviewing, and does anybody have some questions for them? So I have 3 questions here that I want to ask you about. One of them you've pretty much already answered, but I'll let you give one last plug to it at the end. So I'll save that one for the last question.
Sure.
But this first one, so most B2B shows are about me. The good ones are interesting tales of lessons learned along the hard way. What do you do to help the audience avoid boredom on your show?
That was a great question, and I loved it when this gentleman posted that on LinkedIn.
John McTighe, by the way.
Yes, that is a very strong Scottish name. It really goes back to everything I've said before. This show is not about me, right? This show is about B2B marketers and how they can become better, right? And not just that, how they can become better, but how they can make a dent in the universe and make a change in their organizations or in their businesses, right? So how we make it, how are we different? How do we make a difference out there? We really do it by focusing on the guests, right? The show is about the guests, and you'll notice when I post things, I usually don't make it about me, right? I almost always don't make it about me. I make it about what are these issues, these challenges, and also these opportunities that B2B marketers should be tapping into. What is this pain point that they're having right now? And let's amplify the pain point a little bit. And here are some solutions and actionable insights. And guess what? Somebody that I just brought on this week to talk about it, this is what he had to say about that, right? And how do we make it different is we talk about different topics. We also encourage diversity of thinking. And what I mean by that is, you've probably noticed this, but not all my guests are from North America, right? They're from different parts of the world. I have this little thing which I do. I guess you can consider that a little bit unique, but I try to, like, if I know that they're from a different country and a different language, I try to say good afternoon and welcome to the show in their language. I'm not always successful, I'll be honest.
I appreciate the effort, though.
Yeah, and it's also to make people understand that there are so many commonalities, in the field of B2B marketing, and so many things that bring us together despite geographic, cultural, and linguistic differences, and the challenges that people are having in branding, customer success, customer experience, SEO in Latin America are almost the same as the ones in North America or in Europe or in Asia. It's just that they have a different way. They might have a different way of approaching it. And it's interesting. It's interesting to learn about that and understand that, because let's face it, right? And I'm sure it's the same with you. We work with people that are not necessarily in the same country. Like I don't work with most of my clients are not based in Canada, right? They're based in other parts of the world.
I work with people all over the planet, both from my clients to people that I work with for the execution of our content. I mean, if you're not leveraging global talent in this world, I think that you're missing out on the best talent in the world, because, and I think that's something that Americans especially can get much better at, which is that there are people outside of the United States of America that can do really good work. All right. Last question, or sorry, 2 more questions.
Sure.
This next one, do you have any ideas on effective ways to get feedback on your podcast?
Yeah, that's a great one, and that's something we're constantly improving. I mean, at the moment, I'm going to tell you that I'm still using a qualitative approach, and that takes longer and that takes time, right? And what do I mean by that? I try to get feedback from every guest that I interview, and I take their feedback down and see how we can not necessarily enact that feedback, but make adjustments based on what they say, right? The other one is also people I engage with online, like for example on LinkedIn. So people do send me like direct messages talking about the show. Some have also sent me emails about the show. And most of the feedback has been, I have to say, very positive and encouraging. But there have been others that have said, like, hey, listen, so, I mean, besides the feedback you gave on the audiogram, which I really appreciated, but there's others that have talked about, okay, my lighting, my sound. So it gets a little bit more technical and granular. There's another guy that I interviewed based here in Toronto. He gave me some feedback on the show notes and the transcript and how I can improve those. So yeah, I'm always open to, I would say, constructive criticism, right? Anything that will help the show to become better and to gain a larger audience and that will help benefit other people, I'm always open to those conversations.
I kind of feel bad now. It's like I came on your show and just was like, yeah, you're doing it wrong.
No, not at all. I mean, hey, listen, I've only been doing this for a year and a half, so you know, I've still got miles to go. Right?
Awesome. All right. Well, I think this is a good spot to end. We're coming up on time, and so I just want to ask you one last question, which is, where can people go to find you and B2B marketers on a mission?
Sure. Well, first of all, Justin, thank you again for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this conversation. And for those of you that want to reach out and talk about all things B2B branding and B2B marketing, you can hit me up on LinkedIn. So my handle's Christian dash Klepp dash EINBLICK Consulting. So Klepp is spelled Klepp, and then EINBLICK is spelled EINBLICK Consulting. You can also check out our podcast. So it's B2B Marketers on a Mission. So that sits on our website, which is www.einblick.co/podcasts, or anywhere where you get your podcasts. So we're on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and so forth.
All right. Well, Christian, thanks again. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. It was great having you on Recorded Content.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
All right.